$800 a month wasn't enough anymore. Now she wanted $1,600 because Derek needed space for his family. I stood in the kitchen I helped renovate holding the eviction notice my own mother just handed me. The woman who raised me, who called me her rock when the bank threatened foreclosure, was now demanding double rent from the son who saved her house. Meanwhile, my deadbeat brother sat in my basement apartment with his feet up smirking, while his wife made herself at home in my space. 3 years of reliable payments, 3 years of sacrifice, and this was my reward. My name is Pat, and at 28 years old, I thought I understood family loyalty. Working as a licensed electrician gave me decent money and job security. But 3 years ago, everything changed when my parents, Linda and Robert, faced foreclosure on their house. Medical bills from my mother's diabetes treatment had piled up alongside my father's reduced hours at the auto parts store. The bank sent final notices, and desperation filled our family conversations. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I moved back into my childhood home and started paying $800 monthly rent to help cover their mortgage. It wasn't a temporary arrangement in my mind. This was my contribution to keeping our family together and saving the house where I grew up. I didn't just hand over money and call it good. The basement became my project and my new home. I spent weekends running new electrical circuits, installing proper lighting, and transforming the musty storage space into a comfortable apartment. Fresh drywall quality, carpet, a small kitchenette, and even a separate entrance made it feel like my own place. My parents watched me work and seemed genuinely grateful for everything I brought to their situation. Every month I handed over my rent check along with my portion of utilities. Never late, never short, never complaining about the tight quarters or lack of privacy. When the furnace needed repairs, I handled it. When the roof leaked, I fixed it. When they needed help with yard work or house maintenance, I was there with my tools and my time. My mother would hug me and call me their rock. My father would clap my shoulder and say he didn't know what they'd do without me. I felt good about my choice, proud that I could be the son who stepped up when it mattered most. The basement apartment became my sanctuary, small but comfortable, filled with my furniture and my sense of accomplishment. Then Derek came back. My older brother had vanished 4 years earlier after borrowing $15,000 from our parents for what he called a surefire business opportunity. The money disappeared, along with Derek leaving behind only broken promises and my parents' embarrassed silence whenever his name came up. Derek had always been the charming one, the smooth talker who convinced people to believe in his grand plans right up until everything fell apart. His history was a pattern of failed schemes and borrowed money, a landscaping business that never got off the ground, a food truck venture that ended in repossession, a get-rich-quick real estate seminar that cost him thousands. Each failure was followed by Derek asking family for loans to get back on his feet, money that never got repaid, and dreams that never materialized. But Derek had another problem that our parents preferred not to discuss: gambling. I'd seen the evidence during his last stay home, the racetrack betting slips, and the casino rewards cards hidden in his room. The $15,000 hadn't gone to any business. It had gone to feeding an addiction that Derek refused to acknowledge. When Derek showed up at our door with his wife Sarah and their 2 kids, Madison and Connor, my parents welcomed them like returning heroes. Sarah was 26, blonde, and carried herself with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. 6-year-old Madison had Derek's charming smile, while 4-year-old Connor seemed overwhelmed by the constant moving and uncertainty that defined his young life. Derek claimed he was getting back on his feet after a difficult period. He spoke vaguely about job opportunities and fresh starts, the same language he'd used before every previous failure. But he looked good dressed nicely and had enough money for gas and food during their cross-country drive to reach us. Something felt different this time, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I welcomed them despite my reservations. Family was family. And maybe Derek had finally learned from his mistakes. I offered to help him find construction work, knowing several contractors who needed reliable electricians and general laborers. Derek thanked me enthusiastically and promised to follow up on my connections. The first week went smoothly enough. Derek's family crowded into my old childhood bedroom upstairs, and while the house felt cramped with 6 adults and 2 children, everyone seemed to be making an effort. Derek talked about his plans, Sarah helped with cooking and cleaning, and the kids brought energy and laughter back into our home. But then I found the documents Derek left in my bathroom. Legal papers from a workers' compensation settlement dated 6 months earlier. Derek had won $85,000 from a workplace injury claim, money he never mentioned to any of us. The settlement was substantial enough to rent an apartment, buy reliable transportation, and support his family while he looked for work. Instead, Derek was hiding his windfall while accepting charity from parents who struggled to pay their bills. I confronted him that evening when we were alone in the garage. Derek's face went pale when I showed him the papers, but he quickly shifted into damage control mode. He begged me not to tell our parents, claiming the money was tied up in legal complications and investment opportunities. He promised he was planning to contribute to household expenses once everything got sorted out. I wanted to believe my brother had changed, that maybe this time would be different. The Derek standing in front of me seemed genuinely concerned about disappointing our parents again. He swore he would start contributing to expenses within the week and asked for just a little time to handle his financial arrangements. Against my better judgment, I agreed to keep his secret. I thought I was giving Derek the chance to do the right thing on his own terms. I thought he would honor his promise and start helping our parents who had opened their home to his family. I was wrong about Derek, just like I'd been wrong about so many things involving my family. 2 weeks passed without Derek contributing a single dollar to household expenses. My monthly electric bill jumped from $45 to nearly $90 with 4 additional people using lights, appliances, and electronics throughout the day. The water bill spiked from $38 to $67 with longer showers, extra laundry loads, and increased daily usage from Derek's family. I found myself working overtime shifts to cover the increased utilities, while Derek spent his days watching television and playing with his children. When I asked about his job search, Derek always had excuses. The positions weren't quite right, the pay was too low, or he was waiting to hear back from better opportunities. Meanwhile, he drove to restaurants and returned with expensive takeout bags while claiming he couldn't afford to contribute to groceries. Sarah began making subtle comments about my living situation that felt designed to undermine my standing in the household. She'd mentioned to my mother how unusual it was for a grown man to still live with his parents. She'd wonder aloud whether I had ever considered finding my own place and starting my own family. Her tone was always sweet and concerned, but the message was clear. The children's schedules disrupted everything about my routine. Madison and Connor were naturally energetic, and their bedtime didn't align with my need to sleep before early morning work shifts. Their footsteps thundered across the floor above my basement apartment, and their television shows echoed through the heating vents until late evening hours. My mother, Linda, started making comments that felt increasingly pointed. She'd mentioned how nice it was that Derek was spending time with his children and being a devoted father. She'd express admiration for Sarah's homemaking skills and how well she handled the challenges of raising young children. The implication was always there, comparing Derek's family responsibilities to my apparently selfish bachelor lifestyle. Derek's spending habits became impossible to ignore. He purchased new clothes for himself and his family, bought expensive toys for the children, and ordered premium cable television services without consulting anyone about the additional monthly costs. When I calculated his expenditures over those 2 weeks, he'd spent more on non-essential purchases than I paid in monthly rent. I started documenting Derek's behavior and financial choices, partly for my own sanity, and partly because something felt deeply wrong about the entire situation. I photographed receipts he left in common areas, noted his purchases and activities, and kept track of his contributions to household expenses, which remained at $0. The breaking point came when I overheard a conversation between my parents that shattered my understanding of my place in the family. I was returning from an evening shift entering through my basement door when I heard voices in the kitchen directly above me. The heating vent carried their words clearly to where I stood in my apartment. My mother's voice was animated and planning. Derek needed more space for his family, she explained to my father. Two growing children couldn't be expected to share one small bedroom indefinitely. Sarah was pregnant again, though she hadn't announced it yet, and they would need additional room within the next year. My father's response was measured and calculating. They could move Derek's family into the basement apartment, which offered more space and privacy for a growing family. Pat would understand Robert reasoned because he was single and didn't need as much room. The spare bedroom upstairs would be adequate for one person, but Linda had additional plans. If Derek was going to take over the larger, nicer basement apartment that I had renovated and improved, then I should pay more rent to compensate for the household's increased expenses. Derek's family represented additional costs for utilities, food, and general wear on the house. I should contribute more money to help support everyone. The numbers they discussed made my stomach drop. $1,600 monthly rent for the tiny spare bedroom that barely fit a twin bed and dresser. Double my current payment for half the space I currently occupied. My mother's reasoning was that Derek couldn't afford to pay anything right now because he was still getting established and looking for work. I was established and employed, she noted, so I could handle the increased financial responsibility. Derek had children to support and needed to focus his resources on his family's immediate needs. My father agreed with her assessment. I was the reliable one, the one who always came through when the family needed help. Derek was struggling and deserved their support during this difficult time. I would understand because I always understood when family circumstances required sacrifice. They talked about Derek as though he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. They discussed me as though I was a financial resource they could adjust according to their current needs. 3 years of dependable rent payments and household contributions had apparently earned me the privilege of paying more for less, while supporting a brother who contributed nothing. I stood in my basement apartment surrounded by the improvements I had made and paid for, listening to my parents plan to evict me from my home so my deceptive brother could take over the space I had created. The conversation continued above me as they refined their plans. They would present the new arrangement as temporary, just until Derek got back on his feet financially. They would emphasize the family's need to pull together during challenging times. They would remind me of how much Derek's children needed stability and space to grow. But the temporary nature of their plan was clearly fictional. Once Derek settled into the basement apartment, once I started paying double rent, once the new dynamic established itself, there would be no going back. Derek would find new excuses for avoiding financial responsibility, and I would become the permanent funding source for his comfortable lifestyle. I realized my parents had been planning this transition since before Derek arrived. The timing wasn't coincidental. Derek hadn't randomly decided to come home during his time of need. My parents had contacted him, possibly even invited him back, knowing they could manipulate me into supporting his return. My 3 years of sacrifice and reliability hadn't earned me respect and appreciation. Instead, they had marked me as the dependable source of income who could be counted on to accept whatever arrangements the family required. Derek's history of irresponsibility and deception hadn't disqualified him from preferential treatment. Instead, it had established him as the family member who needed protection and support. Standing in the apartment I had built and improved, listening to my parents plan my displacement, I felt something fundamental shift in my chest. The family I thought I was saving didn't see me as a beloved son making a generous sacrifice. They saw me as a reliable source of money who would accept any terms they offered because I had nowhere else to go. That night was the first time I seriously considered that my family might not deserve the loyalty I'd been giving them. The formal presentation came on a Thursday evening when Derek conveniently had plans to visit his old friend Marcus across town. My parents asked me to sit down in the living room for what they called an important family discussion. Linda held a folder containing papers she'd clearly prepared in advance, while Robert positioned himself nearby with the serious expression he used for significant conversations. My mother began with appreciation for everything I'd done for the family over the past 3 years. She acknowledged my consistent rent payments and my contributions to household maintenance and improvements. She emphasized how grateful she and my father felt for my support during their financial difficulties. Then came the transition. Derek's family needed more space, she explained, and the current arrangement wasn't sustainable for growing children. The basement apartment offered better accommodations for a family with specific needs, while I could manage perfectly well in the spare room upstairs. The adjustment would benefit everyone by providing Derek's children with adequate space while maintaining everyone's comfort. She opened the folder and removed a rental agreement she'd typed and printed, complete with new terms and conditions. $1,600 monthly rent for the spare bedroom with utilities included to simplify the payment structure. The increase was necessary, she explained, because Derek's family represented additional household expenses that needed to be covered somehow. Robert added that Derek was actively searching for employment, but needed time to find the right opportunity. His family couldn't be expected to contribute financially until he established steady income, which might take several months depending on the job market. In the meantime, the household's financial responsibilities would fall to those who were currently employed and capable of meeting them. I asked directly why Derek couldn't contribute anything to household expenses. Linda's answer was that Derek was focusing all his resources on his family's immediate needs, like clothing for growing children and transportation for job interviews. Every dollar he spent on rent or utilities was a dollar taken away from his children's necessities. As their uncle, I should want Derek to prioritize his children's welfare over arbitrary financial contributions. The new rental agreement included additional clauses that hadn't existed in our previous informal arrangement. I would be responsible for my own meals and groceries. I would need to provide advance notice for guests or overnight visitors. I would be expected to maintain quiet hours that wouldn't disturb Derek's children during their sleep times. My parents presented this as a reasonable adjustment to changing family circumstances. They emphasized the temporary nature of the arrangement and assured me that once Derek established steady employment, the financial dynamic would shift to a more equitable distribution. They expressed confidence that I would understand the family's needs and accept the new terms without creating unnecessary conflict. I signed the agreement because refusing would have led to arguments and accusations that I didn't care about Derek's children. I moved my belongings from the basement apartment I had improved into the spare room that barely accommodated a twin bed, a small dresser, and a narrow desk. My comfortable living space became Derek's family's new home, while I squeezed my possessions into a room the size of a large walk-in closet. Derek's family settled into their new accommodations with enthusiasm that felt insulting. Sarah rearranged the furniture I'd purchased and placed Derek's belongings in storage spaces I'd built. The children ran through the basement apartment claiming bedrooms and play areas in the space I'd created for myself. Derek lounged in the living room area, where I'd spent quiet evenings after long work days. Within days, I discovered Derek had been lying about more than just his settlement money. I found his job search materials in the garbage applications he'd printed but never completed or submitted. When I checked the websites for companies he claimed to have contacted, their employment pages showed no recent postings for positions matching Derek's supposed qualifications. His job search was entirely fictional, designed to maintain the appearance of effort while avoiding actual work. Worse than his employment deception was what I discovered about his financial activities. Hidden in his belongings, which now occupied my former storage areas, I found documents that revealed a much larger conspiracy than Derek's individual lying. Investment statements, stock purchase receipts, and correspondence with my parents showing Derek had been giving them advice about financial markets and trading opportunities. Derek had convinced my parents he possessed insider knowledge about upcoming corporate mergers and acquisitions based on his previous employment at a logistics company. He'd given them specific stock recommendations and encouraged them to invest their retirement savings in companies he claimed would see dramatic price increases within months. My parents had liquidated their retirement accounts, borrowed against their life insurance policies, and taken cash advances on credit cards to fund investments based on Derek's supposed insider information. They'd invested over $22,000 in various stocks and mutual funds Derek recommended, believing they were positioning themselves for financial independence. The investment statements showed consistent losses. Derek's stock picks had declined in value by an average of 37% since my parents purchased them. Companies he'd promised would merge had announced canceled deals. Mutual funds he'd described as guaranteed winners had underperformed market averages by substantial margins. My parents' retirement savings were disappearing into failed investments, while Derek continued to claim his predictions would prove accurate with more time. The medical bills Linda had mentioned as the source of their financial problems represented only a fraction of their actual debt. The majority of their financial crisis resulted from following Derek's investment advice with money they couldn't afford to lose. My monthly rent payments weren't helping my parents maintain their house. They were funding continued gambling on Derek's worthless stock recommendations, while he used his settlement money for personal expenses and luxury purchases. I discovered receipts showing Derek's spending over the past month since moving in. Expensive dinners at upscale restaurants while claiming he couldn't afford to contribute to groceries, new electronics and clothing purchases while insisting he needed to conserve money for his family's necessities, premium gasoline for the luxury sedan he'd purchased with settlement money while telling our parents he was too broke to help with household expenses. Derek's wife, Sarah, was fully aware of their financial situation and actively participated in maintaining the deception. Text messages between them discussed their strategy for extracting more money from my parents through additional investment opportunities Derek would introduce gradually over time. The double rent demand wasn't about supporting Derek's family during a temporary difficult period. It was about generating cash flow to fund my parents' continued gambling on Derek's fake investment advice, while he enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle using money he'd hidden from everyone. I was subsidizing a complex financial fraud that Derek was perpetrating against our own parents, while they praised him for his business expertise and criticized me for not being more supportive of his efforts to establish himself. That evening, as I lay in the cramped, spare room, listening to Derek's family enjoying the apartment I'd built, I understood that my relationship with my family was based entirely on what I could provide financially rather than any genuine affection or appreciation for who I was as a person. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Living in the spare room was like existing in a storage closet with a window. The space measured 8 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for a twin bed against one wall and a narrow dresser against the other. I had to turn sideways to move between the furniture, and I couldn't fully extend my arms without touching walls on both sides. My belongings that didn't fit in the room stayed in boxes stacked in the garage, making my living situation feel temporary and unsettled, even though I was paying $1,600 monthly for the privilege. The single small window faced north so the room stayed dim and cold throughout most of the day. The heating vent barely reached the space, leaving me constantly chilled during autumn evenings. Derek's family thrived in my former basement apartment. Sarah redecorated with new curtains, furniture arrangements, and household accessories that transformed the space into their permanent home. The children created elaborate play areas using toys Derek purchased regularly despite claiming financial hardship. Derek himself seemed to take particular pleasure in lounging in the living room area where I used to relax after long work days. Sarah's comments about my living situation became increasingly pointed and cruel. She'd mentioned to my mother how sad it was that I'd never learned to live independently like most adults my age. She'd expressed concern about whether I was capable of maintaining my own household or managing adult responsibilities without parental support. Her observations were always delivered in a tone of sweet concern, but the underlying message was clear. I was a failure as an adult man dependent on my parents in ways that reflected poorly on my character and competence. Derek, by contrast, was a devoted family man working hard to provide for his children despite facing challenging circumstances beyond his control. The children were encouraged to treat the entire house as their playground, with no consideration for my need to sleep before early morning work shifts. Their footsteps thundered across the floors above my room during evening hours, and their television programs echoed through walls and vents until late at night. When I asked for reasonable quiet hours, Sarah explained that children needed space to be children and shouldn't be restricted because of one person's schedule preferences. Derek's behavior became increasingly arrogant and entitled as he settled into his role as the favored son. He'd make comments about how nice it was to finally have adequate living space for his family, implying that my previous occupation of the basement apartment had been selfish and inappropriate. He'd thank our parents for understanding that families with children needed priority over single adults who could adapt to smaller accommodations. I was working 50-hour weeks to afford the doubled rent, while Derek spent his days watching television, playing video games, and taking his children to parks and entertainment venues. The contrast was stark and intentional. Derek wanted me to see how comfortable his life had become while mine grew increasingly difficult and cramped. The final betrayal came through another overheard conversation, this one even more devastating than my parents' initial planning discussion. I was returning from a particularly exhausting overtime shift when I heard voices in the kitchen. Derek was talking with our parents about long-term arrangements and future plans. I stopped in the hallway out of sight, but close enough to hear clearly. Derek was proposing that our parents sell him the house at below market value as an investment in his family's future. He explained that he had business connections and real estate expertise that would allow him to renovate and flip the property for substantial profits. The sale would provide our parents with enough money to move into a comfortable senior living community while giving Derek the capital to establish his property investment business. My mother was enthusiastic about the proposal. She loved the idea of Derek turning the family home into the foundation for his financial success. Robert was asking practical questions about pricing and timelines, but his tone indicated genuine interest in Derek's plan. The conversation revealed several devastating details about their perception of my role in these arrangements. First, they were planning to give Derek 30-day notice to evict me from the spare room. Derek had convinced them that he needed the additional space for a home office where he would manage his property investment business. I was seen as an obstacle to Derek's success taking up space that could be used more productively. Second, they believed Derek's story, that I resented his children and felt jealous of his business acumen. Derek had been telling them that I made disparaging comments about his family and questioned his investment strategies because I couldn't accept his superior knowledge of financial markets. Third, they had concluded that I needed to learn independence and stop relying on their generosity for housing. Linda actually used the phrase, taking advantage of our kindness, when describing my 3 years of rent payments and household contributions. The woman who had called me her rock when facing foreclosure now saw me as someone who took advantage of their kindness. Derek's manipulation had been systematic and complete. He'd positioned himself as the ambitious son with grand plans, while portraying me as the jealous, dependent brother who couldn't handle his success. Every conversation, every financial discussion, every family interaction had been shaped by Derek's narrative about our respective characters and contributions. My parents had chosen to believe Derek's version of reality over the evidence of 3 years of consistent, reliable support I'd provided. They preferred his promises of future wealth over my demonstrated history of actual financial assistance. But Derek's plan went beyond just taking over the house. He intended to sell the property immediately after purchasing it from our parents at discount pricing. His talk about renovation and property investment was fiction designed to justify the below-market purchase price. Derek would pocket the difference between what he paid our parents and what he could get from actual buyers, then disappear with the profits just like he'd done with the $15,000 4 years earlier. Our parents would lose their home equity, their retirement investments, and their housing stability all at once. Derek would gain approximately $40,000 in immediate profits while leaving our parents homeless and financially devastated. I sat in my cramped room that night, overwhelmed by the scope of Derek's betrayal and our parents' willingness to participate in their own destruction. They were about to lose everything they'd worked to build because they believed Derek's lies more than they valued my demonstrated loyalty. The emotional weight was crushing. I'd spent 3 years trying to save my family's home and financial stability, only to discover they saw me as a burden who needed to be removed so Derek could proceed with stealing everything they owned. That was the night I stopped trying to save my family and started planning to save myself. I began researching apartment rentals in different parts of the city, looking for places where I could establish my own life, independent of my family's dysfunction. I started gathering documents and evidence of Derek's deception, not because I planned to expose him immediately, but because I wanted proof of what had really happened when the inevitable collapse occurred. Most importantly, I began planning my exit strategy. If my family wanted to choose Derek over me, I would let them experience the full consequences of that choice. But I wouldn't stay to watch the destruction or enable their continued poor decisions through my financial support. I would disappear completely and let them discover Derek's true nature on their own timeline. I maintained my normal routine while quietly planning my exit from a situation that had become completely unsustainable. Every morning I went to work and performed my job with the same professionalism I'd always maintained. Every evening, I returned to the cramped spare room and behaved as though nothing had changed in my perspective on family loyalty and financial obligations. But everything had changed. I spent my lunch breaks and weekends apartment hunting in neighborhoods across the city, looking for places where I could establish genuine independence from my family's dysfunction. I needed something affordable that would allow me to save money and rebuild my life, but also something that represented a clear improvement over my current living situation. I found the perfect place in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from my work site. A one-bedroom apartment in a converted house with hardwood floors, good natural light, and a landlord who appreciated that I had steady employment and references from previous landlords. The rent was $750 monthly, nearly half what my parents were charging me for the storage closet bedroom. I put down the security deposit and first month's rent using money I'd saved from overtime shifts, and I scheduled my move-in date for a Saturday when Derek had promised to take his family on a day trip to visit Sarah's mother in the next county. While planning my physical exit, I continued documenting Derek's deception and financial manipulation. I photographed his expensive purchases and the receipts he carelessly left in common areas. I copied financial documents he kept in my former basement apartment, including his settlement paperwork and correspondence with my parents about investment opportunities. But then I discovered something that made Derek's deception much darker and more dangerous than simple lying about money. Hidden in Derek's belongings, I found documents related to his workplace injury settlement that revealed the entire claim was fraudulent. Medical reports that contradicted each other describing injuries that couldn't have occurred in the way Derek claimed. Correspondence with a friend named Tony Brennan, who worked in insurance investigation discussing how to stage accidents and fake symptoms to maximize settlement payouts. Text messages between Derek and Tony, planning Derek's fake injury timeline and coordinating false witness statements. Derek hadn't been injured at work. He'd staged his accident with help from Tony, who provided insider information about how insurance companies investigate and process claims. The $85,000 settlement was stolen money obtained through fraud that could send Derek to federal prison and force him to repay everything plus substantial penalties. The scope of Derek's criminality was staggering. He wasn't just lying to our family about his finances. He was living off money obtained through insurance fraud while manipulating our parents into investing their retirement savings based on fake stock market expertise. I found communications between Derek and Tony discussing additional fraud schemes they were planning. Staged slip-and-fall accidents at retail stores, fake vehicle collision claims, and property damage scams targeting insurance companies across multiple states. Derek's settlement money was funding a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond our family situation. For a moment, I considered taking this evidence directly to the police or the insurance company Derek had defrauded. The evidence was clear and comprehensive, easily enough to result in criminal charges and prison time for both Derek and Tony. But then I realized exposing Derek's criminality would devastate our parents in ways they didn't deserve, regardless of how poorly they'd treated me. Instead, I decided on a different approach. I would let Derek destroy himself through his own behavior while protecting our parents from the worst consequences of their poor judgment. I would disappear from the family situation and let Derek's lies collapse under their own weight without actively sabotaging him or involving law enforcement. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would move out during Derek's planned trip to see Sarah's mother, taking all my belongings and leaving no forwarding address. I would leave behind a carefully written letter that exposed Derek's hidden settlement money and his lies about financial hardship. But I wouldn't mention the insurance fraud or his criminal activities. The letter would arrive at exactly the moment when Derek would be asking our parents for additional financial support, probably claiming he needed money for rent deposits or transportation expenses related to his fake job search. Our parents would discover Derek's deception at the precise moment when his lies would be most obvious and painful. I wouldn't try to convince our parents that Derek was manipulating them. I would simply provide them with factual information about his financial situation and let them reach their own conclusions about his honesty and character. The timing would be perfect because Derek had scheduled his family trip for the same weekend he'd planned to ask our parents for a loan to cover what he described as unexpected expenses related to starting his new job. He'd been setting up this request for weeks, mentioning concerns about having enough money for professional clothing and reliable transportation. Our parents would receive my letter just as Derek was explaining why he needed additional financial help, despite claiming to be nearly broke for months. I spent several evenings crafting the letter, making sure it contained only verifiable facts about Derek's hidden settlement money and documented lies. I included copies of his financial documents and receipts for his luxury purchases, but I avoided making accusations or expressing opinions about his character. The letter simply presented evidence and asked our parents to consider why Derek had hidden substantial assets while accepting financial support from family members who struggled to pay their own bills. I also prepared for the practical aspects of my departure. I arranged for utility transfers to my new apartment, changed my mailing address with employers and financial institutions, and scheduled time off work to handle the moving process without anyone noticing unusual activity. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for cutting ties with my family. I'd spent 3 years trying to save them, and they'd chosen to believe Derek's lies over my demonstrated reliability. They'd preferred his promises of future wealth over my actual financial contributions. They decided I was a burden to be managed rather than a son to be appreciated. I couldn't save people who didn't want to be saved, and I couldn't earn love and respect from people who saw me only as a source of money. But I could save myself, and I could force my family to confront the consequences of their choices without my continued financial support, cushioning the impact of Derek's deception. Moving day was set for Saturday, October 14th. Derek's family trip was scheduled to last the entire weekend, giving me time to relocate completely and leave behind the letter that would change everything. I was finally going to find out what my family was really made of when Derek's safety net disappeared, and his lies caught up with him. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for starting over. Derek loaded his family into the luxury sedan he'd purchased with settlement money, everyone excited about their weekend trip to visit Sarah's grandmother across the state. I waved goodbye from the kitchen window, knowing it would be the last time I saw them as a member of this household. My parents left for work shortly afterward, my father heading to his weekend shift at the auto parts store, and my mother covering a Saturday morning shift at the medical office where she worked part-time. The house was completely empty, exactly as I'd planned. I'd arranged for my friend Jake to help with the moving, and he arrived right on schedule with his pickup truck. Jake was a fellow electrician who'd been listening to my family situation for months, so he understood why this move needed to happen quickly and quietly. Loading my belongings took less than 2 hours. 3 years of living in increasingly smaller spaces meant I didn't own much furniture or large items. Everything I truly valued fit in the truck bed and my car trunk. I took photographs of the basement apartment's condition to document the improvements I'd made and the care I'd taken of the space Derek now occupied. I left behind the furniture that came with the house and the larger items I'd purchased specifically for the basement apartment. Derek's family could benefit from the furniture and household goods, and I didn't want to create obvious empty spaces that would alert my parents to my departure before they found my letter. The letter itself was sealed in an envelope addressed to both my parents, placed prominently on the kitchen table where they'd find it immediately upon returning home. Inside the envelope were copies of Derek's settlement, documents, receipts for his luxury purchases, evidence of his lies about job searching, and a clear explanation of how he'd been deceiving everyone while living off their charity. My letter was direct and factual. Mom and Dad, by the time you read this, I'll be living in my own apartment across town. After 3 years of paying rent and contributing to household expenses, I've decided to establish my independence rather than continue supporting Derek's deception. The enclosed documents show that Derek received an $85,000 settlement 6 months ago, money he's kept hidden while accepting financial support from you and expecting charity from me. The receipts demonstrate how he's been spending this money on luxury items while claiming he can't afford to contribute anything to household expenses. Derek hasn't been looking for work. His job search is entirely fictional, designed to maintain the appearance of effort while avoiding actual employment. He's been living comfortably off his hidden assets while manipulating all of us into supporting his lifestyle. I won't be returning to this living arrangement. You've chosen to believe Derek's lies over my 3 years of reliable support, and I respect your right to make that choice. But I won't continue enabling his deception or funding his comfortable lifestyle at my own expense. You can reach me at work if you need to discuss practical matters related to my departure. Otherwise, I wish you the best in dealing with the situation Derek has created. Pat. I drove to my new apartment feeling a mixture of sadness and relief that was difficult to process. Sadness for the family relationships that hadn't turned out to be what I thought they were, but relief at finally escaping a situation that had become emotionally and financially destructive. My new place felt like a palace compared to the cramped spare room I'd been occupying. Real windows with natural light enough space to walk around freely, and the quiet that came with living independently rather than in a house full of people who didn't respect my basic needs. I spent the afternoon unpacking and setting up my new home, focusing on practical tasks rather than thinking too much about what was probably happening back at my parents' house. The phone call came at exactly 6:37 p.m. My mother's number appeared on my phone and her voice was shaking when I answered. Linda was crying before she could form complete sentences. She kept saying my name and apologizing, asking where I was, and begging me to come home immediately. She said they'd found my letter and confronted Derek about the documents I'd left behind. Derek had initially denied everything, claiming I'd fabricated the evidence because I was jealous of his success and resentful of his family taking over my space. But when my parents demanded explanations for specific documents and receipts, Derek's stories had fallen apart completely. Sarah had broken down under questioning and confirmed that Derek had been hiding money while accepting charity from family members. She'd admitted they knew about Derek's settlement from the beginning and had planned to keep it secret until they could establish themselves permanently in my parents' house. Derek himself had stormed out of the house after his lies were exposed, claiming my parents were choosing to believe lies over their own son's word. Before leaving, he'd announced that since the family didn't appreciate everything he was trying to do for them, he and his family would find somewhere else to live. My mother was devastated and terrified. She'd realized that Derek's investment advice had cost them their retirement savings while he was secretly wealthy the entire time. She understood that I'd been subsidizing Derek's comfortable lifestyle while paying increasingly expensive rent for decreasing accommodations. Linda begged me to come back home, promising that everything would return to the way it was before Derek arrived. She said they'd made a terrible mistake in how they'd handled the situation, and she wanted to make things right between us. I let her finish her tearful apology before responding calmly. I've found my own place, and I won't be coming back. You chose to believe Derek's lies over 3 years of reliable support from me, and now you can enjoy the consequences of that choice. Derek is exactly who I told you he was, and you defended him while treating me like a burden. I hope you figure out how to handle your situation, but I won't be part of it anymore. My mother started crying harder, saying she understood why I was angry but begging me to reconsider. She admitted they'd treated me unfairly and taken my contributions for granted. She promised they would never make the same mistakes again if I would just give them another chance. Robert took the phone and tried a different approach. He acknowledged that they'd made errors in judgment, but emphasized that family was supposed to forgive and move forward together. He pointed out that Derek was gone now, so the situation had already corrected itself without requiring me to stay angry or maintain distance. I interrupted his speech. Derek isn't the only problem. The problem is that you saw me as someone whose feelings and comfort didn't matter as long as I kept paying rent. Derek was just the excuse you used to treat me like a tenant instead of a son. I'm not angry anymore. I'm done. I told them Derek would probably be back within days as soon as he realized he couldn't manipulate anyone else into supporting his lifestyle. I warned them that Derek's investment advice had been worthless from the beginning, and continuing to follow his recommendations would cost them whatever money they had left. I explained that I knew about their plan to sell Derek the house at below market value, and I advised them to reconsider any financial arrangements with someone who had just been exposed as a systematic liar. Then I delivered the line I'd been planning since I'd overheard their original conversation about my living situation. Enjoy the slackers. You chose them over me, so now you get to live with the consequences. I hung up before they could respond. My phone rang consistently for the next several hours, but I didn't answer. I'd said everything I needed to say, and further conversation would only create opportunities for manipulation and false promises about changed behavior. Instead, I ordered pizza and spent the evening arranging furniture in my new apartment, enjoying the quiet and space that came with living independently. For the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be. 3 months later, my new life was everything I'd hoped it would be when I finally decided to prioritize my own well-being over my family's dysfunction. My apartment had become a real home furnished with items I'd chosen for my own comfort and style, rather than making do with whatever fit in cramped spaces. I'd purchased a comfortable couch, a proper dining table, and a queen-sized bed that fit perfectly in my actual bedroom. The walls displayed artwork I'd selected, and the shelves held books and personal items that reflected my interests and personality. Work was going exceptionally well. My supervisor had noticed my improved focus and energy leading to increased responsibilities, and a promotion to senior electrician with a 15% pay raise. Without the stress of family conflict and financial manipulation draining my emotional energy, I'd been able to concentrate fully on professional development and skill improvement. I'd also started dating Jennifer, a nurse I'd met at a coffee shop near my apartment. She was 26, intelligent and kind, with a straightforward personality that made conversations easy and comfortable. Jennifer couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live with dysfunctional family members when they had the option of independence, which validated my decision to prioritize my own mental health and financial stability. Derek's situation had played out exactly as I'd predicted. He'd returned to my parents' house within a week of his dramatic departure, claiming he'd been teaching them a lesson about appreciation and family loyalty. Derek expected to resume his comfortable arrangement, occupying my former basement apartment while contributing nothing to household expenses. But my parents had used the week of Derek's absence to research his investment recommendations and discover the full extent of their financial losses. Linda had contacted the companies Derek claimed to have insider knowledge about and learned that his predictions had been completely fabricated. Robert had calculated their total losses at over $22,000 money they couldn't afford to lose and couldn't recover. When Derek returned with his family, my parents confronted him about his investment advice and demanded that he start paying rent and utilities if he wanted to continue living in their house. Derek initially refused, claiming his expertise was worth more than monetary contributions and threatening to leave again if they didn't appreciate his value. My parents called his bluff. They gave Derek's family 30 days to find alternative housing, explaining that they could no longer afford to support anyone who wasn't contributing financially to household expenses. Derek's threats and manipulation tactics no longer worked because my parents had experienced the consequences of trusting his promises over demonstrated reliability. Derek was forced to use his remaining settlement money to rent an apartment and support his family without anyone else's assistance. The luxury purchases and expensive lifestyle he'd maintained while living rent-free had depleted his resources faster than he'd anticipated. Within 2 months, Derek was working at a retail store to pay bills, a humbling experience that finally forced him to accept adult responsibilities. Sarah had initially threatened divorce when Derek's deception was exposed, but she'd ultimately decided to stay married while demanding complete control over their finances and budgeting decisions. Derek's manipulative behavior had cost their family financial security and damaged relationships, with his parents' consequences that Sarah made clear would not be repeated. My parents had also learned painful but valuable lessons about favoritism and financial manipulation. Linda and Robert visited my apartment on a Saturday afternoon in January, bringing homemade cookies and genuine apologies for how they'd handled the entire situation with Derek and me. They acknowledged that they'd taken my reliability for granted while making excuses for Derek's irresponsible behavior. My mother admitted that she'd gotten caught up in Derek's promises of financial success because she'd wanted to believe her older son could be successful and responsible. She'd chosen hope over evidence, dreams over reality, and she'd paid the price for that decision. My father explained that they'd seen me as so dependable and capable that they'd stopped considering whether their decisions were fair or reasonable from my perspective. They'd assumed I would accept whatever arrangements they proposed because I'd always been understanding about family needs and financial pressures. Both of them expressed genuine regret for treating me like a guaranteed source of income, rather than a son whose feelings and comfort mattered. They understood that their behavior had driven me away, and that rebuilding our relationship would require changed behavior rather than just apologies. I appreciated their willingness to visit and acknowledge their mistakes, but I was clear about my boundaries and expectations going forward. I explained that I wouldn't be returning to live with them under any circumstances, regardless of how their financial situation developed. I'd learned that I was capable of living independently and preferred the autonomy and peace that came with managing my own household. I told them I was open to rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection, but not on financial dependence or family obligation. Future interactions would need to be voluntary and enjoyable for everyone involved, not driven by guilt or manipulation. I also made it clear that I wouldn't be providing financial assistance if they faced future difficulties. They'd chosen Derek's promises over my demonstrated support, and that choice had consequences that extended beyond temporary hurt feelings. My parents accepted my terms and seemed genuinely committed to developing a healthier dynamic based on respect rather than exploitation. Derek himself had attempted to reach out and apologize for his behavior, claiming he'd learned valuable lessons about honesty and family loyalty during his months of working retail and managing his own expenses. I declined his invitation to meet for coffee or dinner, explaining that I wasn't interested in resuming a relationship with someone who deliberately manipulated and deceived me. Derek's problems weren't my responsibility to solve, and his personal growth wasn't my project to support. I wished him well, but made it clear that his choices had permanently changed how I viewed his character and trustworthiness. The most important lesson I'd learned was about the difference between supporting people you love and enabling behavior that ultimately hurts everyone involved. For 3 years, I'd believed I was helping my family by providing financial support and accepting whatever living arrangements they required. I'd thought my sacrifice was noble and that my reliability would earn appreciation and respect. Instead, my willingness to accept unfair treatment had taught my family that they could take advantage of my loyalty without consequences. My parents had learned to see me as a resource to be managed rather than a person whose needs and feelings mattered. Derek had learned that he could lie and manipulate without accountability as long as someone else was willing to absorb the financial consequences of his behavior. By leaving, I'd forced everyone to confront the real costs of Derek's deception and the unsustainable nature of their family dynamic. My parents had learned to value reliability over empty promises. Derek had learned to support himself instead of living off other people's charity. Most importantly, I'd learned to value my own well-being and establish boundaries that protected my emotional and financial health. Standing in my kitchen on a Sunday morning drinking coffee and reading the newspaper in complete peace and quiet, I realized I'd never been happier or more content with my life. Jennifer was coming over for brunch, and we were planning to visit a local farmer's market and spend the afternoon exploring neighborhoods we might want to live in together eventually. My work was satisfying and financially rewarding. My apartment was comfortable and truly mine. I'd lost the family I thought I had, but I'd gained self-respect and genuine independence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is refuse to enable their worst behaviors and allow them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. Sometimes walking away is the only way to force people to grow and change. My family was smaller now, but healthier, based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency or manipulation. Derek was learning responsibility through necessity rather than choice, but he was learning. My parents were rebuilding their financial stability through careful planning rather than chasing get-rich-quick schemes, and they were doing it without exploiting their children's loyalty. I was building the kind of life I'd always wanted, filled with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide financially. The justice wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet and practical, the natural result of people finally facing the consequences of their choices without anyone else absorbing the costs of their mistakes. I'd found my own place literally and figuratively, and it was exactly where I belonged. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members took your loyalty for granted while favoring someone who contributed nothing? How did you handle it, and what advice would you give to others facing similar family dynamics? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself and setting healthy boundaries with family. And if you know someone who's struggling with similar family manipulation, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening to my story and taking the time to understand why sometimes loving your family means refusing to enable their worst behaviors. I hope everyone finds the courage to create the life they truly deserve, surrounded by people who value their contributions and respect their boundaries. Take care and remember that you're worth more than what you can provide for others.